Professor Khan. Hello and welcome to Al Jazeera. Now, you recently authored a report which analyzed American perspectives on Islam and the Middle East. What exactly has changed and what has remained constant in America's Middle East policy since the September 11th attacks?
Well, there was some radical shift in American foreign policy after September 11 because as a response to September 11, and that was manifest in President Bush's first term. What he wanted to do was to eliminate all potential threats to America from terrorist groups that included what he thought were states that were sponsoring terrorism and were likely to use weapons of mass destruction. And as an antidote to terrorism in the Muslim world, the Bush administration felt that promotion of democracy would be an antidote, and therefore we saw the invasion of Iraq and very massive global onslaught against whatever was deemed as terrorism by the Bush administration. But over the last 15, 16 years since 9/11, American foreign policy has more or less remained the same as it was before 9/11, which means that if 9/11 was a response to American foreign policy in the region, America just doubled down rather than make adjustments to what happened on 9/11.
Now, many of the elements that constituted the Middle East political system before dictatorships, weak civil societies, economic stagnation are still very much in place today. Did Western powers provide the necessary support for newly established democracies after the Arab Spring revolutions or not?
You know, America's support for democracy, especially in the Middle East, has been very sketchy. America has an extraordinarily terrific record when it comes to promoting democracy in other countries, such as Germany after World War II, Japan, South Korea, even Taiwan. These are countries whose democracies have flowered because of America's support. To some extent, Israel continues to remain democratic to some extent and gives a lot of lip service to democratic principles and human rights also because of his relationship with the United States. However, in the rest of the Arab world, the United States has not really been an ally of democracy. For example, in the last 20, 30 years, our best friends in that region have been Saudi Arabia and other monarchies, but we have never advocated that Saudi Arabia become a democracy. And our adversaries in the region has been Iran, and we have always demanded that Iran become a democracy. So sometimes I say jokingly that America treats democracy like an STD. We want our enemies to have it, but not our friends. So in that sense, America's support for democracy has been very sketchy. But that has been on a broad level because of the fear that democracy in the Middle East, especially in Arab countries, will bring Islamist groups to power. So the US had an experience in Palestine when Hamas won the elections. And then, of course, in Egypt after the election of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Americans have become very nervous about democracies in the Arab world. However, at the lower level, support for human rights, support for rule of law, support for freedom of speech and freedom of religion, the State Department and the diplomatic corps continue to provide tremendous support, even in the Arab world and the Muslim world. It's just at the presidential level that we see an antipathy towards elected governments in the Arab world, because elected governments do not align with US foreign policy that easily.
Is it fair to say that the number of countries that now qualify as failing states, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya, is a product of the Arab Spring, or were failing states the rationale and the motives behind popular uprisings?
Well, there are two or three things which are very new in the Middle East, which has come up in the last 4 or 5 years since 2011. One is the clear manifestation of failed states. Even though the failed state index is moving away from failed states to fragile states, to say the states are more fragile, some are broken, some are not. But you can clearly see that many states in the Middle East particularly are broken, and Syria is the best example of that, and Libya is another one, Yemen is the third state. But the other factor that has emerged in the region is sectarianism. The rise of Shia-Sunni tensions. But one could argue that if we looked at states in the Middle East as on the quality of governance, then whether you consider them failed or failing now or were failing in the past, they were really truly badly governed. Even from the 1960s onwards, you could clearly argue that most of the states in the Arab world have been really badly governed, and the bad governance continues.
Now, traditional U.S. allies in the region, such as Turkey and to a certain extent Egypt and Saudi Arabia, are now either estranged or less trusting of U.S. policies. Who is to blame for that?
I think the primary reason for the decline of U.S. influence in the Middle East is the invasion of Iraq. If you notice, the United States spends more money in trying to shape political outcomes, more money and more resources than any country in the world, and yet the U.S. gets the least output out of it. The country which seems to get most of its political outcomes realized is Iran at the moment in the Middle East. It's able to save the regime of Bashar al-Assad with the help of Russia. It has become a kind of a regional imperial power, projecting power in Lebanon, in Syria, now even attacking to some extent indirectly Israel. It dominates Iraqi politics. So Iran is having far more influence on the geopolitics of the region than even the United States. And the reason why the U.S. is unable to exert necessary force and influence is partly because of Obama's second-term policy, which was called leading from behind, allowing other states to take lead, allowing France to be the leader in Lebanon, in Libya, and then also essentially allowing Russia to enter the theater, especially in Syria. So this power vacuum that second term of Obama created has resulted not only in a more aggressive Iran, but involvement of Russia in the region, but it has also allowed the Shia-Sunni tensions to become predominant because the vacuum that was created by U.S. withdrawal, so to speak, from the region has allowed an enhanced competition between Egypt, Syria, Egypt and Saudi Arabia on one side, Iran and Turkey, and to some extent Qatar on the other side, competing for regional domination. So you see that these hostilities are not so much as a result of specific foreign policy decisions that the U.S. has made, but the inability of the U.S. to remain as committed to the region and as engaged because of the structural weaknesses in the U.S. as a result of the war in Iraq. There is fatigue in the public. We don't have the resources. Our debt is ballooning. It's reached $20 trillion now. And people here are worried that America is not great anymore. We need to make it greater. Essentially, a desire among the American population to fix many of America's own problems. So to some extent, America is going to remain very selective in its engagement in the Middle East, which may allow other powers to dominate the region, not necessarily with positive outcomes.
Right. Professor Khan, once again, thank you so much for speaking to Al Jazeera. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Harun.
Poštovani